Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this webinar. I just want to quickly outline a bit of format and technicalities. So we will be recording this webinar and it will be made available soon after the event. Obviously, the slides will be made available to you as well, and you'll see from some of the slides, as you would imagine with a webinar like this about board pay and graphs, etc., some of the text is quite small. So if you can't see it, don't strain your eyes and, press your eyes against the screen to see it. We can actually send this out to you afterwards. The chat function is turned off, so please use the Q&A function. So we will monitor that as we go along. You are able to like or upvote someone else's question, so it will indicate to us if it's a popular question, and you're also able to comment on someone else's question. So please keep the questions coming. We will attempt to answer all of them within this webinar. There may be some that I simply can't answer because it's not to do necessarily with the data that we've got, and I don't want to stray too much into giving my own opinion about things, but we're happy to take any of your questions offline if you wanted to raise them with me afterwards. Participants should be on mute. And there's no video function, so unfortunately, you can see me with my lockdown hair. I can't see you, so I don't know whether that's a good thing or not. I'm going to be presenting for about 30 to 40 minutes, followed by the Q&A. As I say, do feel free to put your questions and comments on the Q&A box. I think without further ado, I'm going to crack on with the presentation. Zena, how many people have we got at the moment?
We've got about 28.
I think we can start. Okay. So if we can just go to the next slide, please, Zena. So again, welcome to all of you to this webinar. As some of you may know, and I think I might just introduce myself. I'm Stephen Bull. I'm a senior consultant at Campbell Tickell. I know a lot of you, and for those who I don't know, welcome to this. As some of you may know, board remuneration has been around in our sector for just under 20 years, I'd say, maybe a little bit around about 20 years. It was then the Housing Corporation that had set a limit of £25,000 for remuneration in housing association boards. Although, as some of you again may remember, the kind of bonfire of policies and good practice notes when the Tory government came in 2010, that all ceased, and there was more of an expectation that pay was going to just be proportionate to the size and complexity of the organisations. And this filtered naturally through to various NHF codes of governance. The survey that we're basing this webinar on was conducted in the first half of 2020. I think we actually launched it around about March 2020. So as some of you may remember, there was a sudden lockdown and pandemic coming to fruition around about that time. And it did actually have an impact on the response rate. So we did pause it during the pandemic as other people had other things to do, and then reinvigorated it in September. And the 100 responses that we've got, although slightly less than 2017, I think are still very significant. They cover a range of organisations. I think it may reflect the fact, the slightly lower figure may reflect the fact that a number of mergers have taken place. It also reflects the fact that the vast majority of housing associations are extremely small and don't pay. So actually, of the ones that are kind of medium to large organisations, this actually represents a very high proportion. And thank you once again for actually responding to the survey. It really does make a difference. This year, we actually included some questions around diversity on the board, and I'll come on to that a bit later. So what I'm going to do today is just present some of the headline figures from the survey. I think also to note that in assessing how much to pay board members, there's always that element of subjectivity and nuance. How complex is the organisation? How much time is taken up in the various roles of board and committee chairs and board members. You know, are you constricted as a registered charity? Are you willing to pay above the median, maybe, to capacity build board members for whom money is a significant issue? And will that attract a more diverse applicant field? So these are other things to consider when you're looking at board pay. It's not just about the money, but I think the money, the benchmarking figures that we're setting out do help set some kind of parameters and guidelines around what to pay your boards, etc. And it gives you a good idea of what other organisations of a similar type are paying. Okay, if we can just go on to the next slide. So looking at organisations that pay. For those that answered the survey, the vast majority are paying now. We can see that, for those of you who can't see the figures, it's 89% of respondents are actually paying their organisation's boards. Just a quick comparison, the 2017 figure was 82%. So we can see that there has been an increase in the organisations that are paying their boards. On the right are some of the reasons that you've noted why some organisations don't pay. The issues around being a registered charity I think, are still very relevant for a number of organisations, and it remains unlikely, really, that the Charity Commission will change their stance, and really for any registered charity to make a convincing case to pay all of its board. And I think for those of you who haven't read it, who are a registered charity, I'd ask you to read Charity Guidance Note CC 11. Obviously, many small associations don't pay and won't pay. Co-ops, almshouses, charities with very old deeds, they're not likely to pay. But of those that are of a certain size, you know, the vast majority are now paying. Let's go on to the next slide. I think one other thing I would mention actually about charities, you know, and I know some of you I'll pause on this slide for a moment. And I know a number of you are registered charities. It does appear quite random that some organisations, when they first registered as housing organisations, were allowed to pay by the Charity Commission, and that as a result they can pay increases every few years, and then some are not able to pay and have to apply a cost of living increase, which, you know, is often insignificant, or they have an alternative approach, which is to convert to a community benefit society. I think one other point I would note around pay, while we're just kind of at this first introductory slides, board pay and staff pay are quite different. We can generally would counsel against aligning them. A number of organisations, you know, have come to us saying, well, we're paying our staff a 2% increase, we want to pay our board the same. They are completely different roles, they're completely different markets as well. So I think you'd need to, when you're considering what to pay your board members, whether to pay them an increase, you need to consider kind of wider implications reputationally around you know, the current environment. Maybe staff have been furloughed or haven't received any cost of living increase at all, or residents being made redundant. And I think there are things to consider around payment of board members, but not to align against staff pay. It may be simply a minute that you have in your board meetings to say that you've decided not to actually review your board pay this year. That's a number of organisations have done that when they've just felt that this is now not the time to be paying their board members any extra. Okay, coming on to this slide. So what we've seen, and we'll show you a few figures in a minute, is that there have been some marginal increases in non-executive pay since 2017. And I think it does show that the market doesn't move that significantly. We're not seeing huge increases in pay. I've always said that it's a sensible sector, and it remains such. You know, we are a charitable based sector. We remain as such. The increases are marginal. In general, our benchmarking for independent committee members, just down at the bottom, generally comes out at around the £2,500 mark. We see the parameters there that are set. That's the 4,200 is really for some very large and complex organisations, but generally it's around 2,500. I think it really is fairly marginal increases that we see over a 3-year period. So we'll come on to the next slide so you can see that. Okay. Again, I'm not expecting you to strain your eyes and looking at the figures. What we've actually done here is presented the difference in chairs pay at a median rate from 2017, which is in blue, to 2020, which is in amber, in some general bands. I think if we were doing benchmarking exercise for you as individual organisations, we would finesse the bands, having discussed with you. But I think you can see from that the increases have been slight. There will obviously be some outliers, with a few of the largest organisations paying, you know, significantly more for a chair, but these are median figures. And it's interesting actually to see, just noting that the median figures for the largest organisations have kind of pretty well stayed around the maximum that the old Housing Corporation used to set as a limit. People haven't generally gone up that much. As again, I've always said we're a sensible sector. So going on to the next slide, again, vice chair as well. Keeping with those parameters, slight increases overall, although it's from what your survey responses showed us, there was a little bit of a dip in between the 100 to £2 million turnover size. It's gone down from 11,000 as a median to 10, and also on units between the kind of 10 to 20,000 unit, again, it's gone down from kind of, you know, 9 to 8. Fairly insignificant, I would say, but I don't know the reasons. You didn't give us the reasons. It may be that there are a number of organisations that are now recording the vice chair as a senior independent director. But I think the main thing is that actually that those figures do remain proportionate to the overall chair's pay as well. So you can see overall a slight increase in pay there. On to the next one. This was a new question that we asked in the survey, and I would also just point, we have to be very careful not to run away with ourselves in surveys and ask so many questions that it puts you off from actually answering. So we do have to try and be careful in the amount of questions that we ask, but we were quite keen to actually find out a little bit more as to whether organisations are starting to introduce the role of the senior independent director and what they're actually paying. It reflects, I think, the growth in this specific senior role. I would suspect that for a number of organisations, the vice chair and the SID figures are often one in the same. So I think if we do a survey in the next few years, we'll be asking a few more nuanced questions around the role of the senior independent director and the vice chair. But certainly we're seeing more and more organisations having the conversation at least around what the difference is between the vice chair and the SID, and therefore whether we actually want to bring a SID into the role as senior board member. So let's just go on to the next question, next slide. So main board member, again, marginal increases, some growth in all the bands. And I think pay does remain modest. I think you will agree. Most of our benchmarking work recommends around the median, and this generally is accepted. So it prevents a kind of spiral around pay. In the last year or so, a number have in our benchmark work not actually led to any recommended increases at all. And I think that does reflect the fact that your charities and some of the other points I raised raised earlier. You know, you don't also, I think more importantly, have a problem in recruiting staff. One of the things we always say in these is that, you know, it's not a given that you would be increasing your pay. I think you have to look at other factors, and you know, the ease of recruitment for board members is one of them. I also think that in the current tough environment, everyone should be seen to be sharing a bit of the pain. So I think that's certainly come across in a lot of board members' discussions around payment over the last year. So let's just go on to the next slide, which is around audit committee chair. It's interesting really here that the figures didn't highlight an increased amount for the audit committee chair with other chairs. Generally, they are around the same, and I will show you another slide in a minute. It would actually be interesting to hear your view on this as to what you're finding. Maybe other committee chairs, such as you know, development and investment, are seen as just as important and do as much heavy lifting as the audit committee. And when I say audit committee, generically, it could be audit and risk committee. Other organisations have a policy, for instance, to have equal remuneration for all chairs of all committees. I think it makes life actually a lot simpler, but that could be part of the kind of overall policy of the organisation. We do generally see an increase in the rate for an audit and risk committee chair over, say, nominations and remuneration, generally because they will be meeting more often. It's not to say that they are a more important committee, because actually remuneration nominations is an extremely important committee. It's around the time given and the general perception of the workload. So going on to the next slide. Again, we've got, you know, the other committee chairs by turnover. There isn't a huge difference in them, so that was kind of quite an interesting finding. I have to say, I was expecting to see audit committee chairs being paid substantially more, but that really isn't the case. And in fact, in some of these slides, some of these figures, other committee chairs seem to be paid more, but that could be because of the way in which people categorise their chair. They may have a different committee, which in effect is the same as audit and risk, but call it something else, and therefore they won't necessarily be categorising it as audit and risk committee chair. It could be an assurance and risk committee chair, etc. So these have to be taken within an overall kind of context of how people answer these kinds of surveys. Okay, so going on to the next slide, please, Zena. So we're looking now at the kind of effects of introducing board pay, and our recruitment certainly reflects this around the calibre of applicants, a greater calibre of applicants for organisations that are remunerating, but it also reflects the greater ask of members and the overall expectation of the role. You can see some of the positive effects that people are noting in the survey around the high calibre of board members, you know, things that we'd expect anyway: improve, you know, good meeting attendance, commitment to the organisation, better working relationships. But, you know, as I've said before, in these kinds of forums around board pay, there will always be those who don't pay and who will still maintain that they attract highly qualified and excellent candidates, and I'm sure they do. It's not just about the money, it's about the alignment with your applicants to the ethos of the organisation, and I think very much around how you sell the organisation to any new applicants. I think all too often there's that expectation of the applicants selling themselves to you when they come for the interview, but there's also that whole role of you making sure that you present them with a really attractive role that they can join and commit to. So let's just go on to the next slide. So committees supporting boards. No surprises here that the Audit and Risk Committee and the Remuneration and Nominations Committee are kind of, dare I say, the most popular committees. But often the Governance Committee, which you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th along, the Governance Committee with 24% of survey respondents said they had a governance committee. They're often very much very similar in scope to the Remuneration and Nominations Committee. So they can sometimes be pretty much the same committees via a different name. We've also obviously seen in service delivery committees, the fourth one along customer service delivery committee, and the operations performance committee can look quite similar in the scope to and the membership of that committee. But that gives you a fairly good range actually of the committees that are around in the housing sector, again depending on the kind of organisations. There are very few finance committees. Can I just go back a slide? Sorry, Zena. Just to note really that there are very few finance committees, and I think that does reflect the primacy of the board around the finances of the organisation. Although, of course, there can be very good reasons for an organisation to have a standalone finance committee to do the heavy lifting around some kind of complex financial issues. So let's just go on to the next slide. Subsidiaries. I think really all I want to draw out from the subsidiary slide here is that there has been quite a clear growth in commercial subsidiaries. A number of organisations have been starting up in the last few years, development companies, market and rent subsidiaries. We're not seeing the remuneration rate for commercial subsidiaries as being higher than that of the board. I think there was once definitely a perception that with a commercial subsidiary, you'd be bringing in all these independent, highly commercial people, and because they're quite often they're profit making, they would be demanding, or there'd be an expectation of paying a lot of money. We actually aren't seeing that in most of our work, and we can only go by the responses that you sent. Most of the commercial subsidiaries, most of the subsidiaries are paying fairly modest amounts at or around what you'd be paying for the main board, or maybe set at a lower rate, with the chair of the committee, for instance, being paid the same rate as a committee chair on the main board. They are modest amounts. So going on to the next slide. So board size. Now this actually, dare I say, interested me, because I was expecting there to be pretty much the same size of board now as there was a few years ago, which was around 9. Over the last few years, and there's quite a lot of evidence to show this, the board size has come down. I mean, some of us will remember those crazy board sizes of 18, 17 board members, and then of course they were reflecting very much a lot of the larger constituency-based boards from LSVT organisations, often with 15 board members. And then there was definitely a drop in the size of board. So I was quite surprised to see that board membership has gone up to 11. And again, it would be interesting to hear your views about that, as to why you think that may be the case, why you are experiencing this growth. Maybe it's because there are more committees to service. I think that's something that organisations really have to think through if they're looking to decrease the size of their board, is to, well, how does that affect the actual servicing of our committees? Excuse me, maybe there are more executives coming onto the board, and we'll go on to that in a minute. And also maybe it's because organisations, when they're looking at their skills matrix and succession planning, are thinking about the range of skills that they need, and whether they can actually fulfill that kind of skills need around, you know, a certain amount of board members, whether they need to actually increase the board by 1 or 2 people. So it'll be interesting to hear your views about that. So can we just go on to the next slide? Because this is around executives on the board. And actually that does show that there's been quite a growth in the number of CEOs on the board, a good kind of 10%, and also finance directors. There's a kind of an 8% increase in finance directors, from 16% to 24. For those of you who can't read the slides, from 50% in 2017 to 61% of housing associations now who answered this survey have got the chief executive on the board, and some of the other directors a far lower figure. So it will be interesting again for the question and answer whether this accords with you. Are you, if not, are you having the discussions around bringing the chief executive onto the board? Certainly what we found was that the board have improved the way it conducts its business, team cohesion, shared accountability, and the provisions of additional business insight to inform decision making were reasons given why they actually organisations decided to bring their executive onto the board. And I think this is going to be something that will probably grow even more in a few years' time. So let's go on to slide number 19. Perceived skills gaps. Again, if you can't see it clearly, then we'll send you the slides. But, you've got development, asset management, customer experience, and digitalization as being the kind of biggest four gaps that were recorded as being needed to fill on the board. They certainly accord with our findings. It will be interesting to see whether boards are starting to look for people who've got experience around the equality, diversity and inclusion field and the sustainability field as the new code of governance kicks in. And the boards are there now to be leading in these areas. It may be a need to actually start bringing in some real expertise in the field onto the board. And while we're talking about kind of starting to talk about equality, diversity and inclusion, and before we go on to the next few slides, which look at that, I think it is just worth saying a bit about this, as the slides really only show where we are now on diversity. I think it's really, really good that the sector wants to have serious conversations around diversity in board recruitment. And a lot of you will have been in other forums looking at this. You'll have seen the new code of governance. You'll have seen some of the main speakers at conference talking about this. And I'm sure a lot of you are having, if not all of you, are having conversations around diversity and inclusion when you are succession planning. And it's certainly been a hot issue in our governance reviews. I mean, most of the governance reviews I've been doing recently, this has been a main area of discussion around how we can start really bringing diversity to the forefront in the organisation, and so that it filters through board recruitment, executive recruitment, and obviously within the wider staff. But I would say that, for those of us who've been around for a while, and I've been working in the sector since 1995. Yeah, I know. This is a conversation that we have been having for a long time. And I think, I'd be a bit bold in saying this, that progress has not been as significant as I'm sure any of us would want. We've been having this conversation around diversity now for years and years and years. And considering that the top people are the ones in the organisation who actually want this to be effected, and the amount of initiatives that have been started, I'm surprised that to a degree, and you'll see some of the figures in a minute, we are still where we are. And I think it's just something to reflect on as to what we can do as organisations to really drive this forward. We often do see clients coming to us when we're doing recruitment with, I would say, a kind of fairly limited or kind of fixed view around what they want. There's a concentration on professional skills, qualified people from the sector. And of course, this is vitally important. I'm not in any way saying it isn't. But I think there is also an opportunity now to start paying attention to other things, so that there is a case for just not always being so over prescriptive in recruitment. I think on occasion, it doesn't have to be every single recruitment round, but I think on occasion, if we can start to think broadly and keep the brief wide, it would really help, I think, in attracting people from more diverse backgrounds to apply for the jobs. The new code, as some of you will be aware, has got a 6-year maximum. I think the wording, I haven't got it with me, but the wording is it's normally be up to 6 years. So it's not being utterly prescriptive there. But the reason for this is very much around to encourage diversity, to encourage churn onto the board. Because if everyone sees out their full tenure, we will still be having this conversation in years to come. So maybe the time has come now for some members to consider their position on the board, and in conversations with the chair, considering whether they need to step down early in order for you to get the difference that you want. It should align with your values as an organisation, and certainly for members acting in the best interests of the organisation. And I realise that this can sometimes have difficult, there can be difficult conversations here, but I think if we don't really grasp the nettle here, we could be having this conversation in 3-4 years' time as well. And I would say that remuneration absolutely does make a difference to people who are on modest incomes. It can really encourage people to come in. So again, when you're looking at remuneration, sometimes it's worth thinking about whether one has to offer a remuneration amount which may be a bit above the median to encourage kind of capacity building for people who may have low income, or just to encourage people to, certain groups of people to actually apply. It's just something to be thinking about in the mix when you're thinking about what to offer people on boards. So I think it's a lot about what the sector wants to say about the quality of the board. And, the numbers I think are important, but I think really what I'm saying is, don't crunch them too much. I think wider around this whole diversity issue. So back to the slides. I've got a few minutes left. If you can just go on to the next slide. All I really want to say here, I think, is that most chairs are men, and most board members are men, it seems too. So we've got quite a way to go in getting the gender diversity different. I've certainly seen some really encouraging signs in some of the work we've been doing around having far more of an equal gender split on the board, and a lot of work has been going on into really trying to encourage more women to come onto the boards, and obviously being quite clear about what the characteristics, qualities people want in chairs. So that's where we are now. I hope things will slightly change in the next 3 years when we present this slide again. Let's go on to the next slide. On the age side of things, again, it's not surprising that most chairs are of a certain age. The grey, for those of you who, it's difficult to see, the grey part is those from the age range of 45 to 64. Nothing wrong with that age range, but 55% are chairs, and then 37% people over 65, with 1% up to 29. And again, looking on the other side, 8% of respondents have at least one member of the group board age up to 29, which is, I can't remember the exact figure, it is slightly higher than the figure that we had in the 2017 survey, or other figures that we've had looked at over time. Going on to the next slide. On ethnicity, on average, 2 board members are from a B and ME background on the board. Still, the vast majority of board chairs are not from a Black and minority ethnic group, 7%. So I think there's a bit of a way to go there on capacity building existing board members, looking to see where the sources of recruitment are, and we'll look at that in a minute. Going on to the next slide, board operations. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I think that gives, and this is what you have said, some good practice examples for increasing board diversity, and I think there's some really encouraging signs there. I'm just going to ask Sade, actually, I know you've been doing a bit of work on diversity mindset. Is there any bullet points that you can share briefly with us before I close this session?
Yeah, I'll try and speak very briefly. Firstly, I'd say that diversity is complex, it's messy, it's uncomfortable, so there's no one single approach to increasing diversity. I think we have to try several concurrent interventions. But I think one approach might be to develop a diversity mindset as a first step to action. So that's about positioning, continuous learning and reflecting. So as part of this, I think it's important for sort of boards and executive teams to have honest and challenging conversations with yourself and your board. So prompt questions might be, who am I? What does diversity mean to me? what are my implicit biases and how does that influence my decision making, my perception of others, and my behavior. And specialized external facilitation might be required to help you unpick some of that. You may want to ask yourself, what is my role and responsibility in providing inclusive leadership? So do I ignore it? Do I excuse it, become immobilized by it? Do I address it? Do I address it now or later? And how can I put my personal advantage to good use? I think it's important to review board practices. So how and to what extent is diversity embedded in board induction, learning and development, succession planning? During appraisals, board members might want to explore what they understand about diversity and what they might need to learn. When succession planning, some boards may want to consider how to increase the number of diverse candidates. So what some of you said in the survey, that you have some board training programs to onboard younger people on the board. So they may not have a formal vote in meetings, but they can still contribute and build their knowledge and experience. I think it's also important to reflect on recruitment and selection processes. So what language has been used. I often hear people say ethnicity is important, but we still can't lower the bar. But ethnicity and meritocracy are not mutually exclusive. What does fit mean, for example? And maybe consider the value of candidates. Consider the value that candidates bring, other than the fact that they're a woman or they're a young person or someone from a Black and minority ethnic background. I think it's important to learn from our stakeholders and about their needs, backgrounds and experiences. So that might help to identify our blind spots in how to create a more inclusive environment where people from all backgrounds can effectively contribute and thrive. And then lastly, I think it's about publicly sharing our learning and models that do and don't work. So I think it's important for boards to be honest about where they are in their diversity journey. So maybe your boards have clear objectives and a clear action plan for increasing diversity. Maybe you're still evolving, you haven't yet discussed it, or maybe your board is actually resistant to it. But even if your board is less diverse, I think being open might attract more diverse candidates because they believe there is a genuine appetite for change. So I think addressing diversity and inclusion, or sort of developing that mindset, is about an ongoing cycle of positioning and action. So firstly, developing a diversity mindset to inform your actions, and then repositioning yourself by reflecting on your actions and learning and adjusting accordingly. So they're just some of my suggestions. As I said, there's no one single approach to increasing diversity.
Thanks, Sade. I think it's also very useful periodically to ask board members to consider their own diverse characteristics, because what you tick in a box when you're applying for a job may not actually reflect how you see yourself as well. So I think, again, just to lob that into the mix. Okay, I'm just coming on to our last slide now, really, which I don't think it's a slide that really ends on a bang. What's the next slide, Zena? Yes, it's really the average annual time commitment for the role. So I think it's an important slide. I think it just goes to show, and again, for you to look at when you've downloaded the slides, just how many days are involved in the role, and whether how this is reflected, how this needs to be reflected when you're considering increasing pay or bringing in pay for the first time, etc. I think that, again, if it's worth monitoring from over time as to whether the actual time commitment grows, because that will have an impact, I think, to a degree, on whether you want to actually start looking at increasing pay. So that's all I wanted to say. I'd like to thank everyone at Campbell Tickell who helped me with the survey and to get all these slides together. And again, thank you to all of you who were participating. We've got some time for questions and answers now, and do please write in. I'll do my best to answer. The first question actually that we had was from an organisation that is a specialist housing association. They've got around less than 1,000 properties, but the income is over 15 million a year, and they've got about 300 employees. So they're actually larger than many medium associations. And they just wondered whether, any themes emerging. My answer is actually there aren't any themes emerging, because a lot of organisations, when they wrote, answered the survey, didn't necessarily categorise themselves as specialist providers. But I do think that the bigger issue for me is when you're doing a remuneration review, these are the kinds of issues that you need to bring to the fore, because it goes to show that the figures in themselves, categorizing you against a certain bandwidth, may not really reflect the complexity of the organization. So I'm happy to have a conversation offline about this, but I do think you need to think, when you're looking at remuneration, as to the that delicate balance between the fact that you are quite a complex organisation, but you're also still a small organisation, and you need to think about how, if you're paying a significantly larger amount than other similar sized organisations, kind of how that's going to look. But I think it's about making sure that you build the case for paying a bit more to reflect the complexity of the role of the board member in that organisation. So we've got time for a few more questions. Do I have any comments on levels of pay for customers appointed, e.g. to the Customer Services Committee? We've had difficulty understanding benchmarks for this area. Yes, we didn't capture that information. I've had a number of organisations that have asked me around whether you can pay customers on a customer service committee. It's a difficult one, because you want to make sure that you're not, if those customers are on benefits of any kind, I'm not saying they will be, but some of them may be, that any payment that you offer doesn't affect their benefit. I think you also have to take into consideration the fact that rarely do Customer Services Committee have a role where decisions are being made. So quite often the responsibility is up to the board, and that has to be reflected, obviously, in the committee. How many times you meet a year, and the scope of the committee. I think those are things that you just need to consider. Generally speaking, I'd be looking at possibly paying a customer committee member around about towards the minimum level of the independent committee members. So round about £1,000. If you've got 4 meetings a year and there isn't a significant amount of decision making going on, that's not a bad amount per meeting, but it all depends on the scope and remit of the committee. Somebody else that says, are other organisations paying a token amount to board members that sit on the board plus 2 committees? Generally speaking, a board member should be paid for the highest role, and so if they are on a committee or 2, they would be paid an amount that's higher than a board member. Sometimes we have seen board members paid a little bit extra for other roles that they do. I think the risk of that is that you suddenly can get to a stage where you have a very complex board remuneration matrix. And in fact, some board members might end up being paid more than the vice chair, if they've got a number of board roles. So I think try to keep it as simple as possible. You would need to ask yourself why some board members would be on 2 or more committees and other board members not on any committee. I think it's about making sure that you have an even spread overall. I think you just need to think that through.
Steve, can I just add, the majority of our respondents do pay their board for the highest paid role, whether they're chair or a board member. So there's only a minority of respondents that pay on a cumulative basis, where they're paid for being on several committees and a board, for example, but most pay for the highest paid role.
Kath Armstrong has just asked about what about paying customers who sit on the main board? Should they be paid the same as other NEDs, providing it doesn't affect their benefits? Kath, absolutely they should, because you are doing the same role. And I think where possible, you want to make sure that you don't end up with a two-tier board of, in effect, residents on the board being paid less than other board members. Why would you want that? They've all got the same role. I do think the issue around benefits is a relevant one. So it may be that one has to do a bit of nuancing to ensure that people do get paid, but it doesn't affect their benefits. But that is a kind of complex issue in itself. But by and large, all board members should be paid the same amount, committee chairs to be paid whatever you decide, and that if possible, all the different roles on the board should be open to as many people as possible. And it should be then based on the skills and experience that you need for those particular roles. Someone's asked, Vanessa has asked about, do others pay board members for being on task and finish groups? Well, to a degree, I'd quite like other people to answer that. I think that I think for board members to be on task and finish groups, that will come under their role as a board member. So if you're being paid as a board member, you have decided as a board to set up task and finish groups. So if you suddenly find yourself overwhelmed by them, then you might need to have that conversation about whether the task stuff is going, but the finish bit of the task and finish group hasn't quite come to, you haven't got what you wanted there and they're still going on too long, or you've just set up too many, and why is that the case? Occasionally you might want to bring independent people onto that task and finish group. I haven't actually seen that, because the nature of a task and finish group is that they're time limited. So it could be quite difficult to bring them on, pay them a little bit of money and then end the group. But that to a degree is up to you. But I think the question was around, do others pay board members for being on task and finish groups? And I would say probably it would come under your overall remit. And in fact, some of the answers, Steve Benson said, we don't at Two Saints. Katie said, no, we don't. It's part of their role. Thank you, Katie. Penny, no, we have one payment for all roles. So I think there's your answer, Vanessa. Any other questions? Can you share who responded to the survey? We won't be sending out the list of organisations that responded to the survey. I think that there's an element of confidentiality, although a lot of obviously the pay details are in the public domain in the financial statements. But if there's any specific issues that you wanted to raise, Katie or anyone else, then do email me and I will happily get in touch with any specific organisation and see if they would be happy to talk to you about any particular issues around board pay, that if it's within a kind of similar cohort. Are there any other questions? We've got about 10 minutes left. Have people found that generally useful? I hope so.
Steve, there's a question from Suzanne Bennett. Oh, I've lost it now. Oh, lost it. Hang on. Have organisations paid travel allowances to board members during lockdown?
We didn't get that information, Suzanne. We didn't ask for it in the survey. I would be surprised whether people are paying travel allowances. A number of organisations, the actual overall board remuneration will cover travel and some other expenses. For some organisations, they keep things separately. They no longer pay travel allowances for petrol, etc. So that they either don't pay them at all, or they keep them quite separate. I think that's all I can say about that, really. Any other questions? Okay. Penny has just asked, interested in your comments about customer insight. chair of this committee is currently being paid less than other committee chairs. It's being reviewed by the remuneration and nominations today in the context of the white paper and together with tenants. Any thoughts? Let's have a look. What other people said. Sorry for the typos. Oh, don't worry about that, Penny. Welcome to my world. I think that's a really good point, actually. I think that, you know, I think you need to look at the overall remit of the committee. If the chair of the Customer Insight Committee, Customer Services Committee is frankly just a different name for a talking shop tenant panel, then you might want to have a justification for paying the chair of that committee a bit less. But if you've actually given them a serious role to do here, maybe look at the consumer standards, maybe have a real in-depth look more at the way in which residents views are being taken on board up to the main board, the role of residents within the organisation and decision making, then I think there could easily be a very good case to say, well, you're the chair of a substantial committee, you should be paid the same as other chairs of substantial committees. I think it's up to you to have that conversation, but I see no reason why that you know, you wouldn't be having some kind of parity across the piece. Somebody's asked if there's a full report to be published. No, this is the information that we're sending out in the public domain. The detailed information of what people have sent in to us we use for our board remuneration exercises when you want to commission us to do that work.
Also to add that the slides will be available on our website as well.
Are there any questions I haven't answered? Okay. Well, we've got 6 minutes left. If there's any other questions that people want to ask, please keep them coming in. It's a very useful exercise to do every so often, just to get an idea of where we are in the sector. I think what I'd like to see when we do this again in 3 or 4 years' time is to see a much greater emphasis on diversity in the sector as well, and how maybe pay is actually affecting in diversity in our sector. And obviously not to do with remuneration, how far the Code of Governance has worked towards increasing diversity in the sector, increasing making a difference around the overall churn on the board. So that's something to look forward to in the next few years. I think unless anyone's got any other questions, we are almost there. Thank you very much for your attendance, and I look forward to seeing you in other guises. You never know, you might all actually meet in person at a conference one day, hopefully. So I'm going to close this now. Another couple of questions have come up, but actually it's just people saying thank you very much, which is very kind of you. Okay, well, on that note, I'm going to close this. Thank you very much for taking the time to come to this, and again, once again, thanks very much for completing the survey in the first place. If there are any specific questions you want to ask, do give me an email. Okay, well, thank you very much then.